Assessing the effects of gamification in the classroom, a longitudinal study on intrinsic motivation, social comparison, satisfaction, effort, and academic performance. Basically, recently gamification, or using elements of online games or video games in the real world, has become a popular trend in both the workplace and education. Because of its similarity to interactive media and video games that students are already finding appealing, gamification is often praised as helping to improve engagement and motivation in students. However, very little empirical research has been done on the long-term effects of gamification on student learning, and what research is available is giving mixed results, with actually having some kinds of gamification actually having a detrimental effect on student learning in the long run. So this study is attempting to, first, address the limitations of previous research, including a lack of a control group to compare how the motivation is changing, maybe using a short treatment length versus comparing how students are changing over time when they have gamification in their classroom, and things like only using a one-time assessment as opposed to checking in with students multiple times throughout their treatment to see how things are going. It's also going to test specific elements of gaming, including badges for completing specific tasks and a leaderboard that's visible to everybody, so you can kind of track your progress in earning badges against other people in the class, as well as focusing on specific aspects of student learning, such as motivation, satisfaction, effort, learner empowerment, and class grades, which gives us our research question: what are the long-term effects of gamification, specifically badges and leaderboards, on motivation, satisfaction, effort, learner empowerment, and class grades? So basically, the researchers thought, first of all, that in a gamified class, students would compare themselves to other students more frequently than in a control class. They would also have lower motivation over time than in a controlled class. Their satisfaction with the class would be lower than the control class. Their effort over time would be lowered than in a control class. And their feelings of how empowered they were to do well in the class would also be lowered over time than in a controlled class, or a class that was more normal and wasn't gamified. And finally, because their sense of intrinsic motivation was lowered because of the gamification, that would also show up in a lowering of their final exam scores versus the control class. And so they did this by, first, the study was conducted using two identical 16-week communications courses taught by one of the authors at a large Midwestern university. One class was required to use the gaming system as part of the course, and the other class was not even informed about the gaming system, and that was being used in the other class. 71 of the total 80 students completed all of the studies throughout the semester, and the classes had both men and women and a mix of racial and ethnicity groups, but you can see that male students and white students were in the majority. So after students in both the gamified and control class gave their formed consent, researchers gave them 4 surveys over the course of the semester. The first survey was given during the first week of the course and was used to track any differences between the groups that might be confounding, including maybe differences in hours of video gameplay, their gameplay habits before they started the course, their overall GPA, how they thought about different kinds of reward systems, how competitive they were, where their self-esteem was starting before they came into the class, how likely they were to compare themselves to other people versus like just be themselves, or what their intrinsic motivation to study the class would have been. And then the other 3 surveys measuring the learning traits examined in the study, such as like motivation and effort, were given every 4 weeks until the end of the semester. And then they also used the final exam scores to see how the students were changing over time. And then the results of the study Basically, they found that none of the confounding variables, such as like people's GPA or their starting intrinsic motivation, were that significantly different between the two classes. And so none of those variables were decided to be confounding instead of just extraneous. However, they did find that the Gamify class over time had significantly lower motivation and lower satisfaction in the class. And so that supported the initial hypothesis. However, things like social comparison and empowerment, while over time through the class, things like social comparison was marginally higher in the Gamify class than in the control class, and empowerment did dip at the beginning of the semester. By the end of the term, there wasn't that much difference to really say that the gamifying of the class definitely had an effect. So these kinds of things were only partially supported by the research, and the research didn't find any difference in effort between the two classes. So that hypothesis about lowering the effort of students was not supported. But finally, the final exam scores in the Gamify class were lower than in the control class. So that does show that there is a chance that the lowered intrinsic motivation of the students will ultimately affect their grades in the long run. So conclusions. I mean, basically, gamification might harm some educational outcomes for students. And they showed that gamification lowered motivation, satisfaction, and senses of empowerment in the class, even if it was just like modestly. And that lowered motivation lowered their final exam scores. So, I mean, that's not particularly great, right? However, some of the limitations of the class, mandatory activities can lower motivation. So basically, there's research showing that if you're forced to do something, like you really don't want to do it. So since the badges and the leaderboard systems were forced on students, that might have discouraged them from wanting to participate in it, which then that might have been something that was like forcing their motivation to be lower, things like that. And finally, I kind of thought the setup was a little bit tacky. Like everything was obviously just random clip art that they'd found off the internet, as opposed to like something cute or something funny that students might actually be like, oh, I want that badge. Oh, I want this. So I wonder if, because in classes where I've seen students like actually hop onto the gamification, it was because they actually wanted to earn the badge for their own wanting to earn the badge, rather than it was like a required thing that they had to earn that badge and it was ugly and they didn't really want it personally. Future research, maybe make the gamification voluntary to see if for students where they're just not that motivated by the class, something a little bit extra and something a little bit fun can make them push themselves a little bit more to do the class. But kids who are already motivated to do the class don't have to bother with it. There might be other factors that come into play with gamification. For example, a publicly visible leaderboard might be scary and pressuring and kind of shut down kids who maybe are shy or have some kind of anxiety about performance or classes or things like that. So those things need to be looked into. And also these things like where gamification makes students have lower motivation about a class or about a subject, like how long lasting is that? Is that something we need to be worried about? Like now they don't like biology anymore because they had gamification in their biology class would be another interesting thing to study. So thanks very much for watching.